The sunlight cracked through the wooden slats of Mrs. Elderberry's bakery, highlighting the desperate fingers of a slender young woman as they reached for a fresh loaf of sourdough. Lillian Murphy had never stolen a thing in her life before the drought of 1877 had claimed her parents' modest farm outside of Pahrump, Nevada territory, leaving her alone and starving in a world that seemed indifferent to her suffering. "Thief, Mrs. Elderberry's shrill voice cut through the quiet morning air. The stout baker moved with surprising speed, grabbing Lillian's wrist as the bread tumbled to the floor. "Marshal! Someone fetch the marshal!" Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. Her gaunt face, once full of youth and vigor, now bore the hollow marks of hunger and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I haven't eaten in 3 days." The commotion drew the attention of the other customers, particularly a tall figure standing by the counter. Lucas Zimmerman had only been in Pahrump for 2 weeks, having ridden in from Montana territory with dust on his boots and quiet determination in his eyes. At 32, he'd seen enough of the world to know desperate hunger when he spotted it. "Madam," he addressed Mrs. Elderberry, his deep voice calm but commanding. "I'll pay for the bread she was taking and whatever else she might need." The baker's grip remained firm on Lillian's wrist. "This ain't about the money, Mr. Zimmerman. It's the principle. We've got laws here." Lucas reached into his pocket and withdrew several silver dollars, placing them deliberately on the counter. $5 should cover the loaf and a few extras. I believe in principles too, Mrs. Elderberry, mercy being chief among them." The baker's eyes widened at the generous sum, her righteous indignation wavering. $5. That's more than 3 times what the bread costs. "Consider it interest," Lucas replied evenly, his eyes never leaving Lillian's face, which had flushed with a mixture of shame and gratitude. Mrs. Elderberry reluctantly released her grip, snatching up the coins with practiced fingers. "Fine, but I don't want to see her sticky fingers in my shop again." Lillian rubbed her wrist, unable to meet the eyes of her benefactor. "Thank you, sir," she mumbled, "but I can't repay you." Lucas retrieved the fallen bread, dusting it off and handing it to her. "I don't recall asking for repayment, Miss Murphy," she replied softly. "Lillian Murphy, Miss Murphy, Lucas Zimmerman." He tipped his hat slightly. "Now, it seems to me a single loaf isn't going to solve your problems. How about we see about filling that pantry of yours properly?" For the first time, Lillian looked directly at him. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes held a kindness that seemed out of place in the harsh frontier town. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and the shadow of a beard framed a strong jaw. She'd seen him around town since his arrival, typically keeping to himself, taking odd jobs and seemingly always watching the horizon. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicious despite her desperate circumstances. Lucas smiled slightly, creases forming at the corners of his eyes. "Because I've been hungry before too, Miss Murphy. And nobody should have to steal to survive, not in a town with as much plenty as Pahrump." The other customers had returned to their business, though occasional curious glances were still cast in their direction. Lillian clutched the bread to her chest, its warmth seeping through her threadbare dress. "I've got a wagon outside," Lucas continued. "If you're willing, we can visit Johnson's general store and get you properly stocked." Lillian hesitated. Taking charity went against everything her proud parents had taught her, but their voices were becoming distant memories compared to the persistent gnawing of hunger in her belly. "Why not just give me the money?" she asked, testing him. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Because I'd rather see it spent on food than buried with you after you collapse from starvation trying to stretch it too far." His bluntness startled her. "I'm offering help, Miss Murphy, not a handout." Something about his directness broke through her defenses. She nodded once, clutching the bread tighter. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman." They stepped out into the dusty main street of Pahrump, the Nevada sun already beating down mercilessly despite the early hour. Lucas's wagon was simple but well-maintained, with a chestnut mare hitched to the front who nickered softly as they approached. "This is Penny," Lucas introduced, patting the horse's neck. "Best companion a man could ask for on the open trail." Lillian approached cautiously, extending her hand to let the horse catch her scent. "Hello, Penny," she whispered, a small smile forming as the mare nudged her palm gently. "She's beautiful." "And smart, too," Lucas agreed, helping Lillian onto the wagon seat. "Knows when a storm's coming before I do, and has a knack for finding water when it seems there's none to be had." As they rode the short distance to Johnson's general store, Lillian found herself studying her unexpected savior. His clothes were well worn but clean, his movements efficient and purposeful. A revolver sat in a holster at his hip, not uncommon in the territories, but he didn't wear it with the swagger of the gunslingers who occasionally pass through town. "You're new to Pahrump," she observed. Lucas nodded. "Came in about 2 weeks back. Been taking odd jobs, getting the lay of the land. Are you planning to stay?" He shrugged. "Hadn't decided, just following work for now." "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Zimmerman?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Lucas, please." He guided the wagon around a water trough. "I've done a bit of everything, ranching mostly. Spent 5 years working cattle in Montana. Before that, some mining in Colorado, even rode with a freight company for a spell." "A jack of all trades," Lillian remarked. "Master of none," he finished with a self-deprecating smile. "But it's kept me fed and moving." They arrived at Johnson's general store, a 2-story clapboard building that served as Parhump's main supplier of goods. Mr. Johnson himself stood behind the counter, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose and a pencil perpetually tucked behind his ear. "Mr. Zimmerman," he greeted with a nod, eyes flickering curiously to Lillian. "Miss Murphy." Lillian was surprised the shopkeeper remembered her name. She'd only been in once, shortly after her parents' passing, to sell some of her mother's silver to pay for the funeral. "Mr. Johnson," Lucas greeted. "We're here to stock Miss Murphy's pantry. I'll be covering the cost." Johnson's eyebrows rose slightly, but he simply nodded. "Of course." "What will you be needing, miss?" Lillian stood frozen, overwhelmed by the generosity and the sudden attention. Lucas sensed her discomfort and stepped in smoothly. "Let's start with the basics. Flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt, pork." He looked to Lillian. "What else might you need?" Finding her voice, Lillian began to list modest quantities of necessities. Lucas quietly doubled the amounts, adding items she hadn't mentioned: tea, dried fruit, canned vegetables, a small sack of potatoes, even a jar of honey. As Johnson tallied the purchases, Lucas wandered to another section of the store, returning with a sturdy hunting knife in a leather sheath and a small book. "The knife is practical," he explained, adding it to the counter. "Every household needs a good blade, and the book." He handed it to her, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, for when the pantry's full but the mind's hungry. Lillian ran her fingers over the book's cover, touched by the thoughtfulness. "You didn't have to, I know," he interrupted gently. "But winter nights get long, and good words can keep a person warm in their own way." Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. "That'll be $12.63, Mr. Zimmerman." Lillian gasped at the amount, but Lucas didn't blink, counting out the money from a small leather pouch. She noticed his hands, strong and calloused, but steady. The hands of a man who worked hard for his money, making his generosity all the more confounding. "Would you like these delivered, Miss Murphy?" Johnson asked as he wrapped the last of the purchases, Before she could answer, Lucas interjected. "We've got the wagon. I'll help Miss Murphy get these home." As they loaded the supplies, Lillian felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said quietly as they climbed back onto the wagon. "You don't need to," Lucas replied simply. "Just tell me where to head." Lillian directed him to the outskirts of town, where a small cabin stood on what remained of her family's land. Most of the acreage had been sold to pay debts after the drought ruined their crops, but she'd managed to keep the house and a small plot around it. The cabin, though modest, showed signs of care despite its state of disrepair. A small garden struggled to survive in the harsh Nevada soil, and chickens pecked listlessly in a coop with a sagging roof. Lucas surveyed the property as he helped unload the supplies. "You've been managing this alone?" Lillian nodded, setting down a bag of flour on her worn kitchen table. "Since my parents passed last spring, the drought took our crops, and then fever took them both within a week of each other." She spoke matter-of-factly, having moved past the raw grief into a dull acceptance. "I'm sorry," Lucas said simply, his eyes taking in the patched roof and worn floorboards. "It can't have been easy." "Life rarely is out here," she replied, arranging the canned goods on a nearly empty shelf. Lucas noted how meticulously she organized everything, treating each item as precious. He also couldn't help but notice the state of the cabin, the leak-stained corner of the ceiling, the window patched with oilcloth instead of glass, the splintering porch steps. "Your garden could use some attention," he observed, setting down the last of the supplies. Lillian sighed. "Everything could use attention. I've been trying to keep the chickens fed and the roof from collapsing. The garden's been secondary." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, thinking, "I've got a couple days before I'm due to help the Wilson Ranch with their cattle drive. I could lend a hand here, get some of these repairs sorted." "Mr. Zimmerman, Lucas," Lillian corrected herself. "You've already done more than enough. I couldn't ask for more." "You didn't ask. I offered," he pointed out. "And to be frank, Miss Murphy, this roof won't make it through another winter without proper patching." She looked up at the stained ceiling boards, knowing he was right. "I can't pay you," she said again. "How about a meal?" he suggested. "You've got food now. I fix your roof, you make dinner." "Seems fair." Lillian couldn't help but smile at his persistence. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Zimmerman." "Lucas," he reminded her. "Lucas," she echoed softly. "And you must call me Lillian," he nodded, a smile warming his features. "I'll be back tomorrow morning then, with tools and some proper roofing materials." True to his word, Lucas arrived the next morning as the sun was just beginning to crest the mountains to the east. He came on horseback this time, Penny loaded with lumber, tools, and a roll of tar paper. Lillian was already up, feeding her chickens in a faded blue dress that had seen better days but was clearly her best. She'd spent the previous evening baking proper bread this time, not stolen, using some of the flour Lucas had purchased. "You're prompt," she called as he dismounted, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She'd braided her long brown hair, but knew the harsh Nevada sun had already left its mark on her once fair complexion. "Days wasting otherwise," he replied, unloading his supplies. "Thought we'd start with the roof, before it gets too hot up there." They worked together through the morning, Lillian handing up materials as Lucas replaced rotted shingles and sealed leaks. By midday, the summer heat had become oppressive, and Lillian insisted they break for a meal. "It's nothing fancy," she apologized, setting out fresh bread, some cheese, and sliced apples. "But it's honest food." Lucas washed up at the pump outside before joining her at the small table. "Honest food is the best kind," he assured her, breaking off a piece of bread and savoring it. "This is excellent. You've got a talent for baking." Lillian blushed slightly at the compliment. "My mother taught me. She always said good bread was the foundation of a happy home. Wise woman, Lucas commented. My own mother believed similarly, though she was partial to pie as the secret to domestic harmony. You don't speak much of your family, Lillian observed, pouring him a cup of coffee. Lucas took a sip before answering. Not much to tell that's worth the telling. Father was a blacksmith in Missouri. Died when I was 16. Mother followed 3 years later. 2 younger sisters, both married now, one in Kansas, one in Oregon. We write occasionally, but the West is wide. And you've been wandering it ever since, he nodded. More or less. Tried settling a few times, but something always seemed to pull me onward. He met her eyes across the table. What about you? Any family besides your parents? Lillian shook her head. I was their only child. Born late in their marriage, something of a miracle, my mother always said. They came west from Pennsylvania when I was just a baby, chasing dreams of land and opportunity. And found Pahrump instead, Lucas mused. She smiled wryly. It wasn't always so hard. We had good years. The land was generous until the drought. She looked out the window at the struggling garden. I've tried to keep their dream alive, but you can't make it rain. Lucas finished gently. After lunch, they moved on to fixing the chicken coop. Lucas worked methodically, reinforcing the structure and patching holes while Lillian weeded what remained of her garden, occasionally stealing glances at him. She couldn't remember the last time someone had helped her without expecting something in return. The local men who'd offered assistance after her parents died had made their intentions clear enough, intentions that had nothing to do with repairing her property. But Lucas worked with focus and respect, never overstepping boundaries, treating her home as something worth saving rather than a convenience to be exploited. As the afternoon waned, he turned his attention to the garden, examining the soil and sparse plants. Your soil's depleted, he observed, crumbling a handful between his fingers. Needs enriching. I know, Lillian sighed, but I haven't had the means to do it properly. Lucas nodded thoughtfully. The chicken droppings help, but it's not enough. Tomorrow I'll bring some compost from the livery stable. Horse manure makes for good growing once it's properly aged. You don't have to come back tomorrow, Lillian protested weakly, though part of her hoped he would. Roof's done and the coop secure, but that porch still needs attention and your garden won't plant itself. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Unless you'd rather I didn't return. No, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. I mean, I'd welcome the help. If you're sure you can spare the time. Lucas's eyes crinkled at the corners. I've got nowhere pressing to be until the Wilson Drive. He glanced at the setting sun. I should head back to town before dark, though. Lillian walked him to where Penny waited patiently, loaded with the remaining tools. Thank you, Lucas, for everything. He mounted in one fluid motion, settling into the saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Make sure you lock your door tonight, he advised, suddenly serious. I always do, she assured him, puzzled by his tone. Good. There've been reports of drifters in the area. Probably nothing to worry about, but better safe than sorry. With a tip of his hat, he rode off, leaving Lillian standing in her doorway, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the gathering dusk. True to his word, Lucas returned the next morning with a wagon loaded with aged manure from the livery stable, along with lumber for the porch and, to Lillian's surprise, several packets of seeds. Carrots, beans, squash, and tomatoes, he explained, showing her the packets. All hardy enough to grow in this soil, even this late in the season, if we give them a proper start. They spent the morning enriching the garden soil and planting, Lucas demonstrating techniques he'd learned from farmers throughout the territories. Lillian worked alongside him, her initial awkwardness giving way to an easy rhythm of cooperation. "Where did you learn so much about gardening?" she asked as they watered the freshly planted seeds. "Picked it up here and there," he replied, adjusting the flow from the watering can to ensure it fell gently on the soil. "Spent a winter with a family in Oregon who could grow just about anything. The mother there, Mrs. Abernathy, had a way with plants that seemed almost magical." "You've lived many lives, it seems," Lillian observed. Lucas smiled. "Just one life with many chapters. Each place teaches you something if you're willing to learn." After the garden was planted, they turned their attention to the sagging porch steps. Lucas worked methodically, removing the rotted boards and replacing them with fresh lumber. Lillian held nails and handed tools, learning the basics of carpentry as they went. "My father would have appreciated this," she said as Lucas finished securing the last step. "He always meant to fix these, but there was always something more urgent on the farm." "That's the way of it," Lucas agreed, testing the steps with his weight. "The house always comes last after the fields and animals are tended." As the day progressed, Lillian found herself increasingly comfortable in Lucas's presence. His quiet competence was reassuring, and his occasional stories about his travels revealed a thoughtful, observant nature. By the time evening approached, the cabin looked more cared for than it had in months. "I should repay you somehow," Lillian insisted as they stood admiring their work. "A meal hardly seems sufficient for all you've done." Lucas shook his head. "I didn't help for payment." "Then why did you?" she asked, genuinely curious. He considered her question for a moment. "Because everyone needs a hand sometimes. And because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I saw something in you standing in that bakery that reminded me of myself some years back. Too proud to ask for help, but desperately needing it all the same." Lillian felt her chest tighten at his perception. "And what happened to you then?" "When you needed help, someone offered it," he said simply. "An old rancher in Wyoming who caught me trying to steal eggs from his henhouse. Instead of shooting me for a thief, he offered me work and a place at his table. Taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, it's just part of being human." They stood in silence for a moment, the setting sun casting long shadows across the newly repaired porch. "Will you stay for supper?" Lillian asked finally. "I've made a stew with some of the provisions." Lucas nodded, his eyes warm. "I'd be honored." Over dinner, they talked more freely, the barriers between them lowering with each passing hour. Lillian shared stories of her childhood, of her parents' dreams for the farm, of the community Pahrump had been before hard times came. Lucas spoke of his travels, of magnificent landscapes and the varied characters he'd encountered across the frontier. "What keeps you moving?" Lillian asked as she poured the last of the coffee. "Most men are looking to claim land, build something permanent." Lucas stared into his cup for a long moment. "I thought I was looking for something better over the next horizon, a place that felt right. But after a while I think I was just running." "From what?" "Putting down roots, taking the risk of belonging somewhere." He looked up at her. "It's safer to keep moving. No disappointments that way." Lillian understood more than she could express. After her parents died, she'd considered leaving Pahrump, starting fresh somewhere else. Only the thought of abandoning their dream had kept her tethered to the struggling farm. "And now," she asked softly, "are you still running?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Before Lucas could answer, a distant crack of gunfire broke the evening calm, followed by the sound of galloping horses and shouting men. Lucas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with practiced caution. "Get away from the windows," he instructed, his hand moving instinctively to his holstered revolver. Lillian complied, her heart racing. "What is it?" "Riders. 4, maybe 5. His expression was grim. "Coming this way." The thundering hooves grew closer, and soon they could make out raucous laughter and drunken whoops. Lucas extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness illuminated only by the dying embers in the fireplace. "It's probably just cowboys from one of the ranches, blowing off steam," Lillian whispered, though she didn't sound convinced. Lucas shook his head. "Cowboys don't usually ride out this far from town for their entertainment." He moved to the door, checking that it was securely barred. "These are the drifters I mentioned. They've been causing trouble up and down the territory." The riders circled the cabin, their shadows visible through the windows as they passed. One fired a shot into the air, causing Lillian to flinch. Come out, wherever you are." A slurred voice called. "We know someone's home, saw the smoke from your chimney." "Just ignore them," Lucas murmured, positioning himself between Lillian and the door. "They'll get bored eventually and move on." But the riders showed no signs of leaving. One dismounted, his boots heavy on the newly repaired porch steps. "Look at this, boys," he called. "Someone's been doing some carpentry. Bet it's that pretty little widow Murphy everyone in town talks about." Lillian paled in the darkness. She'd never considered how visible the improvements to her property would be, how they might draw unwanted attention. The man pounded on the door. "Miss Murphy, we're just being neighborly. Why don't you open up and offer some hospitality to weary travelers?" Lucas's hand remained steady on his revolver, but he made no move to draw it. "We wait them out," he whispered to Lillian. "Drawing first is asking for a bloodbath." The pounding continued, accompanied by increasingly crude suggestions from the men outside. Lillian pressed herself against the wall, trembling but resolute. Suddenly, the sound of another horse approaching caused the drifters to fall momentarily silent. "Evening, gentlemen," a new voice called, firm and authoritative. "Seems to me Miss Murphy isn't interested in company tonight." "Marshal Davis," one of the drifters muttered. "What brings you out this way?" "Funny thing," the marshal replied evenly. "Mr. Zimmerman mentioned to me he'd be helping Miss Murphy with some repairs, and that he'd spotted suspicious riders in the area. Thought I'd ride out and make sure everything was peaceful." Lucas exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Before leaving town that morning, he'd spoken with the marshal, expressing his concerns about the drifters and mentioning where he'd be. There was a tense silence outside, broken only by the shuffling of horses. "We were just having some fun," one of the drifters finally said. "No harm intended." "Then you won't mind continuing your fun back in town," Marshal Davis replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Unless you'd prefer accommodations in my jail." Grumbling, the men mounted their horses. "This territory's getting too civilized," one complained loudly as they prepared to depart. "That's the general idea," the marshal responded dryly. Lucas and Lillian remained still until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did Lucas move to the door, opening it cautiously to find Marshal Davis still sitting on his horse in the yard. "Evening, Zimmerman," the lawman greeted, tipping his hat. "Miss Murphy." "Thought I'd check in, given the reports of trouble." "Appreciate it, Marshal," Lucas replied, stepping onto the porch. "They seemed determined to cause problems. Bunch from up Montana way," Davis explained, dismounting. "Been working their way south, stirring up trouble in every settlement they pass through. I've telegraphed ahead to the next few towns." He glanced at the house. "Place is looking better. You've been busy." Lillian appeared in the doorway, composed despite the recent scare. "Would you like to come in for coffee, Marshal? It's the least I can offer for your timely arrival." Davis accepted, and soon the three were seated around Lillian's table, the lantern relit, and the tension gradually dissipating. "I don't expect they'll be back," Davis assured them, accepting a cup from Lillian. "Not with me knowing their business. But all the same, Miss Murphy, it might be wise to have someone around for a few days, just to be safe." Lillian glanced at Lucas, a question in her eyes. "I can stay," Lucas offered without hesitation. "I'll bed down in the barn, just until we're sure they've moved on." Relief washed over Lillian's face, though she tried to hide it. "If you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition." "Not at all," Lucas assured her. Marshal Davis finished his coffee and stood. "Well, that settles that. I'll be heading back to town. Zimmerman, walk me out." Outside, the marshal lowered his voice. "Those men are more dangerous than I let on. Suspected in 2 killings up north. Nothing proven, but I wouldn't turn my back on them." Lucas nodded grimly. "I figured as much. Thanks for the warning." Davis mounted his horse. "You're good with that revolver." "Good enough," Lucas replied evenly, "but I'd rather not test it." "Same here." The marshal gathered his reins. "Take care of her, Zimmerman. She's had more than her share of hardship." After the marshal departed, Lucas returned to find Lillian preparing the small guest room. "You don't need to sleep in the barn," she said firmly. "This was my parents' room. It's proper enough with me across the hall." Lucas wanted to protest, but saw the determination in her eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. Later that night, as Lucas lay in the narrow bed that had once belonged to Lillian's father, he found himself unable to sleep. The house creaked and settled around him, unfamiliar yet somehow comforting. Through the thin wall, he could hear Lillian's soft movements as she too seemed restless. His thoughts drifted to their interrupted conversation at dinner. She had asked if he was still running, and he hadn't answered. The truth was, for the first time in years, he felt the urge to stay still. There was something about Lillian Murphy, her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship, that resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. Dawn found Lucas already up, checking the property's perimeter before starting a fire in the kitchen stove. When Lillian emerged from her room, dressed in a simple work dress with her hair braided down her back, she found fresh coffee waiting. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though her grateful smile belied her words. "Least I could do for the accommodations," he replied, pouring her a cup. "No sign of our visitors from last night." "Good," she said with obvious relief, "though I'm still glad you're here." They settled into a routine over the next few days. Lucas continued making improvements to the property, fixing fence posts, reinforcing the chicken coop, repairing a leaky water pump. Lillian tended to her newly planted garden, prepared meals, and even began sorting through her parents' belongings, something she'd avoided since their deaths. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Nevada desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked about books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that forms only between people who feel no need to fill empty spaces with words. On the third day, Lucas mentioned his commitment to the Wilson Ranch. "The cattle drive starts tomorrow," he said as they ate breakfast. "Should last about a week." Lillian nodded, trying to mask her disappointment. "Of course, you've already done far more than I could have expected." "I'll check in when I return," he promised. "Make sure everything's still in good order." "I'd like that," she replied softly. That afternoon, as Lucas prepared to leave, Lillian presented him with a package wrapped in brown paper. "For the trail," she explained. "Just some bread and dried apple tarts." Lucas accepted the gift, surprisingly moved by the simple gesture. "Thank you, Lillian. I'll think of you when I eat them." Their eyes met and held for a long moment, both aware of the connection that had formed between them, neither quite ready to name it. "Be safe," she said finally. "You too," he replied. "Bar your door at night. And if those men return, I'll fire your rifle into the air 3 times." she finished, referring to their agreed-upon signal that would carry to the Wilson Ranch, which was within earshot of her property. But they won't be back. Marshal Davis has been checking in daily. Lucas nodded, satisfied with the precautions. With a final tip of his hat, he mounted Penny and rode off, turning once to see Lillian still standing on the porch, her hand raised in farewell. The week of the cattle drive proved longer than Lucas had anticipated. The Wilson herd was larger than expected, and a sudden thunderstorm scattered the cattle, adding days to their journey. Throughout the long days in the saddle and cold nights around the campfire, Lucas found his thoughts returning to Lillian's cabin, to her resilient spirit and gentle strength. He'd known many women in his travels, saloon girls, ranchers' daughters, widows looking for protection in the harsh territories. But none had affected him like Lillian Murphy, with her pride intact despite desperate circumstances, her willingness to work alongside him without complaint, her quiet companionship on the porch as day faded into night. By the time the cattle drive concluded successfully, Lucas had made a decision. After collecting his pay from Wilson, he rode directly to Parham's land office. Meanwhile, Lillian had thrown herself into caring for her rejuvenated property. The garden showed promising signs of life, with tiny green shoots pushing through the enriched soil. The chickens were laying better in their improved coop, and the house itself seemed to stand straighter, as if the repairs had restored not just its structure but its dignity. She missed Lucas more than she cared to admit. His presence had filled the empty spaces of her days, brought purpose back to her routine. More than once, she found herself glancing down the road, hoping to see a familiar figure on horseback approaching. On the 10th day after Lucas's departure, Lillian was hanging laundry when she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Shielding her eyes, she made out a wagon rather than a lone rider. As it drew closer, she recognized Lucas driving, with Penny tethered behind. Her heart lightened at the sight, though she schooled her features to show only polite welcome as the wagon pulled into the yard. "You're back," she called, walking toward him. "The drive went well." Lucas jumped down from the wagon, looking pleased but nervous, an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "Well enough. Took longer than expected." He gestured to the wagon, which was loaded with lumber, tools, bags of seed, and various supplies. "I brought a few things." Lillian surveyed the loaded wagon with raised eyebrows. "A few things? Looks like you've bought out half of Johnson's store." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "I wanted to talk to you about something, Lillian." Her heart quickened at his serious tone. "Of course. Come inside. I just made fresh coffee." "Actually," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I'd rather show you something first." He withdrew a folded document, handing it to her with careful movements. Puzzled, Lillian unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she recognized the official seal of the Nevada Territory Land Office. "This is—" She began, scanning the document. "Deed to the adjacent 100 acres, Lucas confirmed. The old Peterson claim. It's been sitting abandoned since the old man passed 2 years ago. Land office was just waiting for someone to claim it." Lillian looked up, confused. "You bought land here in Parham?" Lucas nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "I did. Land with good water rights and soil better than what you're working with now." He paused, gathering his courage. "I was thinking of building on it. A proper house, maybe a barn to start." Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she held the deed. "You're staying in Parham," she said, a statement rather than a question. "That depends," he replied, taking a step closer to her. "Lillian, I've spent years drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. But these past weeks, working alongside you, sharing your table, watching the sunset from your porch, "I've found what I was looking for." Her breath caught as he continued. "I'm not a man of fancy words," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "But I know what feels right, and this being here, being with you, feels right in a way nothing else has." "Lucas," she whispered, her heart pounding. He reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own. "I'm not asking for promises, just a chance. The Peterson land borders yours to the south. Good land that would complement what you already have. We could work it together if you're willing. See where this leads." Lillian looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face, open, honest, hopeful. In the short time she'd known him, Lucas Zimmerman had shown her more kindness and respect than she'd received from anyone since her parents' passing. He'd helped her without conditions, treated her as an equal, seen value in both her land and her character. "I'm willing," she said finally, her voice stronger than she expected. "More than willing, Lucas." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. Without hesitation, he pulled her into an embrace, his arms strong and secure around her. Lillian leaned into him, feeling for the first time in months that she wasn't facing the world entirely alone. When they finally drew apart, Lucas looked down at her with such tenderness that words seemed unnecessary. Still, he offered them. "I can't promise it will be easy. The land is demanding and we're both stubborn people. But I promise to work alongside you, to respect your thoughts and wishes, to build something worthy of both our dreams." Lillian reached up, touching his weathered face with gentle fingers. "That's all anyone can promise. The rest we'll figure out together." In the weeks that followed, the transformation of both properties was remarkable. Lucas moved into the Peterson cabin temporarily while beginning construction on a new house straddling the property line, a symbolic joining of their lands. Lillian's garden flourished under their combined care, and Lucas used his cattle experience to secure a small starter herd that would graze the expanded acreage. Word spread quickly in the small community of Pahrump. Some gossiped about the impropriety of their arrangement, but most were supportive of the union forming between two people who clearly complemented each other's strengths. Marshall Davis made a point of stopping by regularly, not out of concern but friendly interest, often staying for dinner and sharing news from town. Mrs. Elderberry, who had once called for Lillian's arrest, now purchased eggs from their growing flock of chickens, grudgingly admitting that at least something good came of that theft. By November, with winter approaching, Lucas and Lillian stood together on the porch of their newly completed house. Larger than either of their original cabins but still modest, it represented the merging of their separate lives into something shared and purposeful. "It's beautiful," Lillian said, leaning against Lucas's shoulder as they surveyed their work. The house overlooked fields now prepared for spring planting, a sturdy barn housing their small but growing herd, and a chicken coop 3 times the size of Lillian's original. "It still needs furnishings," Lucas pointed out, "and curtains at the windows." "And children's laughter to fill it," Lillian added softly, looking up at him. Lucas turned to her, his expression a mixture of surprise and joy. "Is that something you want? Children?" Lillian nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "With you, yes, when the time is right." He drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I think the time is right for one thing at least," he murmured. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band. "I've been carrying this since I returned from the cattle drive, waiting for the right moment." Lillian's eyes widened. "Lucas." "Lillian Murphy," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need my protection or help, but because I believe we're better together than we could ever be apart." Tears filled Lillian's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Lucas Zimmerman, I will marry you." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. As the sun set over their joined lands, casting long shadows across the fields they would work together, Lucas and Lillian sealed their promise with a kiss that spoke of hard-won understanding, mutual respect, and a love born of genuine compassion. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in Parham's small church, attended by the Wilson family, Marshall Davis, Mr. Johnson, and even Mrs. Elderberry, who brought a wedding cake as her gift. Lillian wore her mother's dress, carefully altered with wildflowers in her hair. Lucas stood tall in a new shirt, his eyes never leaving his bride as they spoke their vows. "I take you, Lillian, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he promised, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Lillian repeated the vows, her heart full as she looked into the face of the man who had first caught her stealing bread and had ended up giving her so much more than a full pantry. He had given her partnership, respect, and a future bright with possibility. As winter settled over the Nevada territory, the Zimmerman farm stood as a testament to what could be built from the most unlikely beginnings. Lucas and Lillian spent the cold evenings planning for spring planting, reading together from the poetry book he had given her, and learning the rhythms of married life. Lucas continued to take occasional work with neighboring ranches, his reputation for reliable labor spreading throughout the territory. Lillian expanded her garden plans, experimenting with varieties that might thrive in their challenging climate. Together, they built a life anchored in mutual support and genuine affection that deepened with each passing day. By their first anniversary, the farm had expanded again. A new well provided reliable water even in the driest months, and their cattle herd had grown enough to provide a modest but steady income. Lillian's garden produced not just for their table but enough to sell in town, particularly her herbs and preserves, which became sought after throughout Parham. And in the spring of 1879, as their second year together began, Lillian shared news that completed the circle of their unlikely love story. "Lucas," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky, "I believe we'll need to prepare the small bedroom sooner than we planned." His brow furrowed momentarily before understanding dawned. "You mean?" Lillian nodded, her hand moving to her abdomen. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. By winter, we'll be 3 instead of 2. Lucas's face transformed with wonder as he pulled her close. "A child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our child." "A new beginning," Lillian agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. "Just like the one we made that day in Mrs. Elderberry's bakery." As they sat together, planning for this new chapter in their shared story, both reflected on the unlikely path that had brought them to this moment. A desperate attempt to steal bread had led to a full pantry, which had led to a repaired home, which had led to joined lands and hearts, and now, a family. "I used to believe that moving on was the only way to find what I was looking for," Lucas mused, his hand gently covering Lillian's where it rested on her still flat stomach. "But all along, what I needed was to stand still long enough to recognize it when it appeared." "And I thought I had to face everything alone," Lillian replied, looking up at the man who had become her husband, partner, and dearest friend, "until a stranger caught me stealing bread and showed me another way." Their son, Samuel James Zimmerman, was born on a crisp November morning in 1879, with Dr. Wilson attending and the women of neighboring farms assisting. Lucas paced outside until the first cry rang out, then burst into the bedroom to find Lillian tired but radiant, holding their swaddled newborn. "He has your eyes," she told him as Lucas gently took the baby in his arms, marveling at the tiny, perfect features. "And your determination," Lucas replied with a smile, noting the strong grip of the infant's fingers around his own. "He'll need it growing up on this land." As the years passed, the Zimmerman farm became known as one of the most prosperous in the region, not because it was the largest or most profitable, but because it thrived when others struggled, a testament to the complementary strengths of its owners. Lucas's practical knowledge combined with Lillian's careful planning created a homestead that weathered drought, harsh winters, and the economic uncertainties that plagued the territory. Samuel grew into a sturdy, thoughtful boy with his father's quiet competence and his mother's quick mind. By the time he was 5, he had a sister, Emma Rose, who arrived in the spring of 1884, bringing new joy to their expanding household. Pahrump itself grew alongside the Zimmerman family, transitioning from a struggling outpost to a proper town as Nevada achieved statehood and more settlers arrived. The railroad came through a neighboring settlement, bringing increased commerce and opportunity. Through it all, Lucas and Lillian remained constants in the community, he serving occasionally as a deputy when Marshal Davis needed assistance, she helping to establish the town's first proper school. On warm summer evenings, they still sat together on the porch of the house they had built, watching their children play in the yard where once Lillian had struggled to grow even the most basic crops. Sometimes when the children were asleep and the night was quiet, Lucas would remind Lillian of their beginning. "Do you ever think about that day in the bakery?" he would ask, his arm around her shoulders. "Often," she would reply, her head resting against him. "Though I still maintain stealing that bread was the most honest thing I ever did." "How do you figure that?" he would tease, though he knew her answer. "Because I wasn't pretending to be anything other than desperate," she would explain. "And you weren't pretending to be anything other than kind. We started with absolute truth between us. And that truth, the recognition of genuine need met with genuine compassion, remained the foundation of their life together. A reminder that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most enduring love." By 1897, 20 years after that fateful day in Mrs. Elderberry's bakery, the Zimmerman farm had become a landmark in the region. Samuel, now 18, worked alongside his father, introducing modern farming techniques learned during his studies in Carson City. Emma, 13, showed Lillian's talent for gardening, experimenting with new varieties that could withstand the Nevada climate. Lucas's hair had silvered at the temples, and lines of laughter framed Lillian's eyes, but the connection between them remained as strong as ever, perhaps stronger, tempered by years of shared struggle and joy, loss and triumph. On the 20th anniversary of their meeting, Lucas surprised Lillian with a gift, the deed to Mrs. Elderberry's bakery, which had come up for sale after the old woman's passing. "What on earth will we do with a bakery?" Lillian asked, bewildered by the unexpected present. Lucas smiled, the same warm smile that had first given her hope decades earlier. "I thought perhaps Emma might like to try her hand at baking, or Samuel could use the space for his agricultural supply ideas. Or maybe," he added, his eyes twinkling, "we should just keep it as a reminder of where our story began." Lillian laughed, touching the deed with reverent fingers. "A story that started with an empty pantry and a stolen loaf of bread." "And ended with a legacy," Lucas finished, looking out at their thriving farm, their growing children, and the community they had helped build from the dust of the Nevada desert. "Not ended," Lillian thought as she leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Just continued," with each day writing a new chapter in a story more beautiful than either of them could have imagined that desperate morning in Pahrump so many years ago. A story that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the greatest acts of love begin with the simplest acts of kindness, even something as small as paying for a loaf of stolen bread.